Nice to see you again. It is Filling in the History yet again. I am the amateur historian. Today we're going to be talking about Doctrine and Covenants sections 41 through 44. And inside of this is going to be kind of a long one, I assume, because we are talking about another enormously important section of the Doctrine and Covenants that is still used to this day. So you have the Articles and Covenants, which is section 20. And then you also have section 42, which is the law. So the Articles and Covenants and the law sort of combine together, and that is the basis to this day of how the church operates. So going to jump right into it. We're even going to get some, at the time anyway, anti-Mormon interpretation of what some of these sections mean, which I actually kind of get a kick out of. So starting in right now with section 41. The earliest version of this is from Revelation Book 1. It is called the 44th Commandment, and we get some grammatical changes to this document, as you can see. We do get a few additions to the Revelations. So a couple of grammatical things, and what I get a kick out of that I've never mentioned before is that all of the things like you may see here in these images, like the triple line underneath the letter still means capitalize. I didn't realize that like a lot of these, like a caret to insert and just all these kind of symbols that we've been using to annotate documents have been going on for a very long time. So I don't know, little dweeby thing there, but I think that's kind of interesting. But we do have some additions to this revelation. So we get this one, which is when I come and behold, I come quickly, is actually an addition made in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. And then another one we have, given to them that are not worthy, or to dogs, or pearls before swine is what the rest of it is. That one was added by John Whitmer. It used to just say, children of the kingdom should be cast before swine, and that was it. So there was an addition of, dogs and people who are not worthy and all this kind of stuff. So, and what used to say, it is meet that my servant Sidney should have a comfortable room to live in, was changed to, by John Whitmer's hand, to as seemeth him good. In this section, what happens is that Joseph is the commandment kind of says like, look, Joseph needs a place to translate. This is the Bible still. We're talking about translating the Bible. Revising the Bible probably is a better way of saying it. And to do his work, he was they were kind of commanded to kind of build him a house, which was actually not really uncommon. This was a lot of religious societies would build homes for each other back in this time. And then apparently Sidney didn't get one, which is fine. We'll actually get to a very interesting thing his son mentions later on about sort of Sidney's position before he became a Latter-day Saint. So anyway, this section also is found in Revelation Book 2, handwriting of Frederick G. Williams. There are no corrections on that one, but this is one of two sections that we get that actually exist in both Revelation Book 1 and 2. So 44th Commandment here. It is chapter 43 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 1 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. So, getting into John Whitmer's history, which becomes a lot more prevalent here. And again, this is from Histories Volume 2, is where we get a lot of the extra footnotes and the historical introductions and things for that. We do get, it is included as the first revelation of his second chapter. So John Whitmer's story moves on. Chapter 1 is over now, and we move on to chapter 2, and this is the first thing you get. Before we get into that, though, there are some significant changes to the section headings between 1981 and 2013. And so I didn't know how to do this succinctly, so I'm just going to read them off. So if you had a 1981 version of the Doctrine and Covenants, it would have said, revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet to the church at Kirtland, Ohio, February 4th, 1831. And this is from History of the Church, Volume 1, pages 146 and 144. 146 and 147. Wow, can't read. Anyway, the Kirtland branch of the church at this time was rapidly increasing in numbers. Prefacing this revelation, the prophet wrote, the members were striving to do the will of God as far as they knew it, though some strange notions and false spirits had crept in among them. And the Lord gave unto the church the following. That's 1981. In 2013, when the section headings were redone, This was one of the major changes. So now we get revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet to the church at Kirtland, Ohio, February 4, 1831. This revelation instructs the prophet and church elders to pray to receive God's law. See section 42. And that's going to be the big one today. Joseph Smith had just arrived in Kirtland from New York, and Lehman Copley, a church member in nearby Thompson, Ohio, requested Brother Joseph and Sidney Rigdon live with him, and he would furnish them houses and provisions. The following revelation clarifies where Joseph and Sidney should live, and also calls Edward Partridge to be the church's first bishop. So that's a big change between the two. Again, some people said that the church changed their scriptures in 2013. If you want to call section headings changes to scriptures, sure, but the actual content of it remained the same. In fact, one thing that was interesting, I don't know if I mentioned this in a previous episode, but in the document that the church put out, there's a whole essay that the church put out about changing scriptural references based on what they've learned from the Joseph Smith papers. They actually wanted to keep the format the same so the pages look the same. So they didn't really make humongous changes even to the, in terms of spacing anyway, to the section headings. So they really try to keep the format the same as far as how it looked. So not a whole lot of changes there, especially not to the actual content of the revelations. These section headings are more of an explanation. So just as a footnote, I don't know if I've mentioned that before. So that's a bit about the papers. So circumstantial introduction to section 41. Revelation book 1 gives 44th commandment given February 4th, 1831 at Kirtland, Geauga County, Ohio, given to the church in these parts. It pointed at the office of Edward Partridge, etc. And there was a man by the name of Copley, who was Lehman Copley, in the township of Thompson, who had requested his brother Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon to live with him, and he would furnish them houses and provisions, etc. Then by Joseph inquired of the Lord and received as follows. Revelation book 2 is a little different, a lot more concise. It says commandment given February 4th, 1831 to choose a bishop, etc. So this is the first time that a bishop is mentioned as an office in the church. And this would be the closest equivalent today would be what we would now call the presiding bishop. So if you're not aware, there's the president of the church has 2 counselors. That is the first presidency, highest office in the church. Underneath that, you have 12 apostles, and these 15 people, including the first presidency, hold keys of the priesthood. Like that's where the keys come from, and they are the authorities of the church. Then it's kind of interesting. The temporal affairs of the church are actually handed over to another presidency, or bishopric in this case, where you actually have a presiding bishop who has 2 counselors, and they handle all of the temporal affairs of the church, just like Edward Partridge was at this time. Now, from a local level, there's bishops at every single ward level. So if you live in a ward, which is an organization of the church, you're going to have a bishop, and his job as well is going to be temporal affairs mostly, taking care of people in the ward and making sure they're okay. So that is the first time this is ever mentioned, is section 41. So I find it interesting that Revelation book 2 says this is about calling a bishop, whereas as you can see with the other introductions we've had, it's like maybe you mention it, maybe you don't. The Book of Commandments gives us this. It says a revelation to the church in Kirtland, Ohio, and also the calling of Edward to the office of bishop, given February 1831. So some of the brief introductions there. The Whitmer history gives us a little more, and I'll just start this again. It starts in chapter 2. So here we go, chapter 2. About these days, Joseph the prophet and Sidney Rigdon arrived at Kirtland to the joy and satisfaction of the saints. The disciples had all things common and were going to destruction very fast as to temporal things. For they considered from reading the scripture that what belonged to one man, a brother, belonged to any of the brethren. Therefore they would take each other's clothes and other property and use it without leave, and brought on confusion and disappointments, for they did not understand the scripture. After Joseph lived here a few days, the word of the Lord came, saying. So they got really zealous about this and just started kind of taking stuff. And everybody was like, you can't just take my stuff. Anyway, so it was a whole mess. So that's what section 41 is all about, is Joseph clarifying what all this means. And so thank you, John, for a very, very good introduction to this. And he also just lists out the revelation after that. The manuscript history gives us, again, a very kind of similar, but maybe a little bit more positive take than John Whitmer does. And it says, the branch of the church in this part of the Lord's vineyard, which had increased to nearly 100 members, were striving to do the will of God as far as they knew it, though some strange notions and false spirits had crept in among them. With a little caution and some wisdom, I soon assisted the brethren and sisters to overcome them. The plan of common stock, which had existed in what was called the family, whose members generally had embraced the everlasting gospel, was readily abandoned for the more perfect law of the Lord, and the false spirits were easily discerned and rejected by the light of revelation. 4th February 1831, Friday, the Lord gave unto the church the following revelation at Kirtland, Ohio. Again, February 4, 1831. And so, what we get from this is there was a clarification. There was about 100 people living what was called the family law. So in Kirtland, there was a family, we've mentioned this before, that were really trying to separate themselves from the world, sort of homestead on their own and just trade with each other. And then everything was just free for all. Like there was no rules behind it. And those converts that joined the church and then Sydney left to go to New York started trying to do the same thing all over again, which makes a lot of sense. Joseph came and sort of clarified that. And then you get this revelation, which is pretty cool. So Documents Volume 1 gives us a historical introduction. Says this revelation was dictated the same day Joseph Smith arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, from New York. According to John Whitmer's headnote, inscribed a few months later in spring of 1831, the revelation was a response to Joseph Smith's prayer regarding an offer made by new convert Lehman Copley to provide Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon houses and provisions on his farm in Thompson Township, Ohio, about 20 miles east of Kirtland. Joseph Smith and his family were in need of housing because of their recent move, and Sidney and Phoebe Rigdon had lost a house apparently being built for them by his former Campbellite congregation in nearby Mentor, Ohio, when he converted to the Church of Christ. Early published versions of this revelation did not include Whitmer's headnote, and in later histories, neither Joseph Smith nor Whitmer connected Copley's offer to this revelation. Both histories instead place the revelation in the context of concerns about religious excesses among the new church members in Ohio. The revelation, however, does not explicitly address this matter. So the things that John Whitmer was talking about. So what about this Thompson offer? This becomes a very significant thing later in the history. We'll get to that at a later day. It says, from the historical introduction, the revelation instructed church members that Joseph Smith should have a house built in which to live and translate, and that Sidney Rigdon should have a comfortable room to live in. Though silent about Copley's offer of assistance, Joseph Smith's history explained that upon their arrival in Kirtland, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith were kindly received and welcomed into the house of Brother Newell K. Whitney. The history continues, I and my wife lived in the family of Brother Whitney several weeks and received every kindness and attention, which could be expected, and especially from Sister Elizabeth Ann Whitney. Although neither Joseph Smith nor Sidney Rigdon accepted Copley's offer to live in Thompson, Copley made a similar offer a few months later to the group of church members migrating to Ohio from Colesville, New York. So that's the Thompson offer, as I call it. You know, where do you want to live? Do you want to come live with us or not? And this would explain why there's a lot of talk about, Joseph needs a place. Joseph and his family need a place to do their thing. And then we get to the office of the bishop. John Whitmer's headnote in Revelation Book 1 listed another purpose for this revelation, pointing at the office of Edward Partridge, who the revelation commanded to be ordained as the church's first bishop. This is the first extant document that uses bishop as an office of the church. And there you have it. Who's Edward Partridge again? I think we've gone over this before, but Partridge, again, was a hatter and a convert. He was formerly in the Shaker Society. That was his religion. Who met Joseph a few months previous, was baptized 2 days after meeting Joseph, and then served a mission based on a revelation he received from Joseph. We get this from the historical introduction. Partridge spent the next month and a half sharing his new faith with relatives and friends in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, an effort that his daughter Emily later characterized as unsuccessful. He returned to New York from Massachusetts in time to join Joseph Smith, Emmett, and Sidney Rigdon in their move to Ohio during the last week of January 1831. So, months in, and this guy has served a mission. He is now moving to Ohio and now called as the bishop of the church, dealing with property and taking care of the poor. So, again, just to reiterate, like, the church has not been around for a year yet. Okay, and our numbers are very small. You're talking about a maximum of maybe 100 people that are in the Kirtland area, at least, by the time Joseph arrives. And so we're not talking about an enormous crowd. Big enough, though, I think, for a very early on church. But Edward Partridge was one of those that was asked to do quite a lot, and seemingly he went for it. I mean, there's a lot of notes that we'll get to in a moment here about that. So a little bit about the content and some of the footnotes from this revelation. The revelation itself has this statement in it: "Behold, I give unto you a commandment, that you shall assemble yourselves together to agree upon my word, and by the prayer of your faith you shall receive my law, that you may know how to govern my church." Footnote 4 from this clarifies. It says, "The 2nd of January, 1831 revelation directing the members in New York to remove to Ohio had promised the reception of, quote, my law in Ohio." The first part of a revelation titled in Revelation Book 1, "The Laws of the Church of Christ," was received 5 days after this 4th of February revelation. So kind of fun that they were able to kind of combine their faith, and they said, we really want this law. We've moved to Ohio. And then, yeah, like right away, 5 days later, you get it. The revelation also says, quote, "It is meet that my servant Joseph should have a house built in which to live and translate." And footnote 6 about this says, "Rather than accepting Copley's apparent offer, to live in Thompson, Joseph Smith stayed in the Kirtland area. After their initial stay with the family of Newell K. Whitney, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith moved into a small frame home on the property of Isaac Morley, another land-owning Ohio convert." As a side note to this, kind of a personal note to this, my wife and I actually went to the Manti, Utah temple, and Isaac Morley, part of his temple clothing that he had is actually framed in that building. So Isaac Morley was a very major figure in the early church history. And you can see, if you ever go to the Manti temple, it's sort of an artifact from his life, which is kind of fun. We're talking about moving to Ohio. And I believe we've already spoken to the fact that, you get a bunch of people selling property all at once, and the market forces are going to drive the prices down. Well, how far did they get driven down? I found this footnote 8 about Edward Partridge and his properties. This was not a poor man. He owned land. He was I think haberdasher is the term, but he was a hatter. He owned a hat shop in the area. So he had a business, he had land, he was in good shape. So footnote 8 was very revealing to me. And it says this: "Partridge owned a hat shop near the town square in Painesville, Ohio." There it is again. "And a few miles from Kirtland, as well as multiple pieces of property in the area." Partridge's daughter later recalled that after this revelation was dictated, her father sold his property and, quote, realized but little from the transactions. She added, "My father's course in joining the Mormon religion and sacrificing his property caused his friends of the world to think him insane. They could not see what there was in religion to make a man give up all worldly considerations for it. Partridge's willingness to part with both his business and property in the area, however, predated his affiliation with the Church of Christ. On the 8th of September, 1829, the Painesville Telegraph carried a notice of Partridge's intent to liquidate all of his Ohio assets. Quote, "Wishing to quit the hatting business and leave Painesville, I now offer my land for sale, together with an assortment of stock, trimmings, and tools. My shop is large and commodious, and is pleasantly situated on Main Street near the public square, and is the only hat shop in town. On the lot with the shop is a convenient dwelling house, barn, and an excellent well of water." unquote. Partridge also offered for sale other large parcels of land, including a farm lying on the south part of Harpersville containing 100 acres. And further to this, the hat shop was still open for business in November of 1831, so months later. And while his 100-acre farm near Harpersville, Ohio had been sold, Partridge received only one horse with accompanying bridle and saddle as payment. Some of Partridge's land remained unsold until March of 1832. So we're in February of 1832. So the fact that or 1831, excuse me, February of 1831, a lot of stuff doesn't get sold until the end of the year or the following year. And for a 100-acre farm, he got a horse and a bridle. And that's just to kind of give you a sense of how much loss at least one person incurred. So the aftermath of this, a few days later, in the presence of 12 elders, we are told, we get, quote, the law that was promised for the believers that moved to the Ohio.